I found out about an organization that gets dogs out of labs, and this is a really small number of dogs. I mean, most dogs that are used for research and testing and other animals are euthanized, so they never make it out of the lab. But there's a small number that, after the research is done, they can be adopted out. And so I volunteered with his organization, signed up as a foster, brought home this dog as a foster dog, and wasn't sure that I wanted to adopt him because at that point I was a travel writer. And I just thought, oh my gosh, he can't even leave the house. He was so nervous. He never didn't want to leave his bed. We'd go outside and every little noise scared him. I tell a story in the book about a leaf fluttering down from a tree and he would jump or cringe. And it wasn't until he ran away because he was just scared. I don't know if he was running away from me. He just was afraid. So he ran away and I ran, this is in a neighborhood that was in a different state. I ran a few blocks and found him. And it wasn't until that point that I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot imagine losing this dog. And whatever I need to do, I am going to adopt him. This wasn't a foster situation anymore.
This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Melanie D.G. Kaplan, who is a writer I have admired for years, having read her in the Washington Post and many other places, writing about everything, including her travels and, going around the country and seeing things and doing things. But I have been following the story of her new book for a long time now because Melanie would write about the dog that she had rescued and had a whole series of columns on this, including an email to me one day telling me that the dog had passed away and she and her friends, including me, were mourning for her dog. And so let me get more formal here. Melanie is a journalist who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. She interviewed Miss Piggy, John Bon Jovi, and Isabella Rossellini, among many others. And Isabella Rossellini is the only one that makes me jealous, by the way. I would have always liked to have seen her. She is the author of the newly released Lab Dog, A Beagle and His Human Investigate the Surprising World of Animal Research. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I would ask you to please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, It Has to Be Said commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you can also follow my new project, thegospelofzip.com. And we're here to talk about Melanie's book, not mine, but I will say this. My book is also about a dog named Zip. And that's all I'm going to say on the subject because we're here to talk about your book. So first of all, it came out October 14. And Melanie, you've been on the road and on the phone and online doing promotion. How's it going so far?
Oh, it's great to see you. I'll just say that. And it's been going really well. I had a fun launch party the day it came out, and my first talk was just outside DC in Bethesda, and C-SPAN covered that. And it's just been a really fun energy around it. I think when I was writing the book, it's a really tough topic, and my goal was to write it in a way so that people could read it and and get through something that we don't often talk about and don't want to face. And I think that the story of Hammy has kind of risen to really represent more of what the book is about, the love story with Hammy and my relationship with him. And in the process of reading about that story, I hope people learn something about what's happening with dogs.
Yeah, and I think, I am a reader of yours. I read you before I knew you. I read you before I interviewed you. So I don't come to this podcast primarily as an interviewer and a podcaster. I come as a fan, and I'm not saying that in some sort of flattering way to do all that kind of thing. But I just want to say the way I discovered the issues that your book implies, even though it's the story of a dog and a woman and a loving relationship and a rescue in every sense of the word, was the kind of thing that I also was introduced to when I began to read some of the people who, I'm not sure whether you quoted her, and so I got to her, but bioethicist Jessica Pierce and other people who write on animal welfare and, should I say, non-welfare in terms of what we humans do to animals. And so, with no particular order in mind, I think the first person I interviewed about animal welfare was actually Moby, the music star who is, vegan and has dogs and has gone through a whole journey of understanding that these are our fellow creatures. And then, my own journey into the Greek Orthodox tradition, which I have been part of, and went to Mount Athos in Greece. And I tell the story of meeting a monk there who ran this little animal hospital out of a cave and had these birds with broken wings that other monks would bring him.
Mm.
And I remember getting to Mount Athos one morning, and this does have something to do with your book. And there was this old white horse standing there without a halter or ropes or anything, with a sway back. Obviously, it had a working life. And I asked the priest who was my guide there, well, what does the horse do? This is like 30 years ago, thinking, oh, what do they do? Does it plow fields? What happens? And he said, oh, no, this horse has no task other than to experience joy. And that, I think of that when I read your book, because, and I sort of tear up at this, but what you gave Hammy was moments of joy, and he had never known joy. And it means so much to me having a little dog that I love who sleeps in my bed. And I often think of you and Hammy, and genuinely mourned when you lost Hammy, because I can only imagine what will happen when Zip's scarily graying hairs, fulfill their prediction of mortality, this weirdly unmatched lifespans of humans and their beloved animals. So, you and I are very much on the same wavelength, and your book really touches me on a number of levels. One is this bigger question of how we treat animals, which your book is really all about, your relationship, and then the loss after all this time together and everything you did for him. Having to rearrange your house so this poor animal that could barely walk could navigate and so forth. So I'm going to begin with the ending, not the ending of the book, but the ending of the story that I sort of went through with you viscerally when Hammy passed away. Let's start there, and what that day was like, informed by this journey you took with this animal, who, as I say, you gave the great gift of joy to, because for the first time in his life, it was peaceful and it was beautiful. And he had someone who really saw him as a fellow being. So I think it's a tremendous story. And I just want to tell anybody that, if you're, and I know this sounds hackneyed as well, just like saying I regard you so highly. And then believe me, you're going to do all the talking after this. But we're coming up to the holiday season of various traditions. And if you're going to give a gift this year that actually means something, please give Melanie's book, because it's the most humane message of how we ought to all treat each other, whatever species we are. I mean, it is truly the gospel message in the sense of the good news of what a restored relationship can be like. So with that introduction, I'm going to ask you about the book, but I want to first ask you about that day Hammy passed away and what was going on in your mind after taking that journey with him.
Well, I haven't talked much about that day, but I will say that everything changed in terms of my writing after that, because I had this idea in my mind, and this was certainly a little fantastical, that Hammy was going to be on a book tour with me. And I mean, he would be 16 now, and he would not be wanting to, be in front of a crowd and tour around, although he might still enjoy being in a car. But, I knew realistically he wasn't going to be with me. But I just had this in my mind. I didn't want to let that go. I just had to keep believing that he could be there and not want to think about the end, just like what you said about Zip. I mean, you can't imagine these times because they're so hard to think about. And so I had written the whole book in the present tense when I talked about Hammy. He is this, he does this. And then after I lost him, I was in this deep grieving and mourning, and I had big deadlines with the book. And I had to go back and change everything about him to past tense. He did this and he was this, and he used to curl up under my arm, and just the process of doing that, it was painful. I think it also must have been really therapeutic. And I don't know if you feel this way, but the parts of the book where I got to write about him, whether it was, the way we went to sleep at night, or, just being out and walking with him, the way his body felt, just petting him and his ears and feeling his ribs through his thin fur. And I
Yeah.
mean, that writing brought me so much joy because it's what I know intimately. I say at one point I knew his body, as
Yeah.
well as I knew my own.
Yeah.
Just every square centimeter between his
Yeah.
toes and under his ears, and the very little bit of the Gospel of Zip that I've now listened to. I noticed that you do the same thing, just describing him physically, and it's so nurturing. Like it just
Yeah.
felt really good to be able to do that after he wasn't here.
Yeah. There's something interesting. I perhaps this hasn't occurred to you, but and I know this is going to sound terrible, but there would have been a worse thing to happen to you and Hammy than him passing, and that is you passing first. And you're not old, but when I read Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's book on dogs, and she writes beautifully on dogs and has loved dogs and has written one of the most influential books in my life called The Old Way, about the time she spent in the 1950s with the Sand People of the Kalahari. And she has always had dogs, and she's a wonderful dog person. But she writes movingly about losing dogs. But the most moving passage she has is about her mother's beloved companion when her mom died.
Mhm.
And she writes about how this dog was just lost for the rest of her life. There was no way
Mm.
to change that. This was her person. She would go sit on the couch and just wait and be there and look up hopefully. And this went on for several years. And I think one road to understanding the depth of the relationship you had with Hammy and that I have with Zip in a different way is to understand that this is a two-way street. And you were Hammy's salvation, but you were also Hammy's human. And you're dealing better with losing Hammy than Hammy could have dealt with losing you. At least it's a thought I want to propose. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. You know, earlier, soon after I adopted him, I did take some trips, and I left him with a neighbor for a week and left him with another friend for, I had traveled internationally. But in his last several years,
Yeah.
I didn't like leaving him at all. I didn't like leaving him for an afternoon. And it felt good to know that I was his human, and it felt good to be able to, give him that, to have
Yeah.
something and somebody dependable, and oh my gosh, to be that for somebody. I
Yeah.
mean, even people that have children, they grow up and they
Sure.
fly off on their own, and it feels good to be able to do that, especially for somebody who had a really rough beginning, like Hammy did and Zip did and so many other animals. So
Yeah, and you
feels
can
like a
explain
gift.
something to a child of a certain age, but I know that when I leave anywhere, and by the way, my travel and Jeannie's travel, my wife's travel is restricted to times when Jessica, my daughter, can house sit Zip because she's the person he gets on best with. So it's complicated to do anything. Uh, but that said, the interesting thing is, Zip is intelligent enough that he knows what happens when you pack a suitcase.
They do. Yeah, no, they're pretty clever. Hammy,
Let me back up here just a second and do what I should have done at the beginning, but that's the problem. I'm too into your story to not remember that not everybody is aware of it. Give me a thumbnail of the kind that, and let's see, I forget when that article was in the Washington Post or was it the Wall Street Journal, wherever, but the first time I encountered you, you were telling the story and sort of setting it in the lab dog context of, I don't want to ruin you. I think you said something like this: I don't want to ruin your day, but here's what happens to all these animals. why don't you just bring us up to speed on two things and let me be quiet here for a minute while you tell us A, the situation from which Hammy was rescued, B, his journey with you and the steps he took and how that daily life advanced. And one thing that always struck me very forcefully was the disabilities he had coming from having sat in a cage. By the way, my wife broke her arm about 3 months ago, and it's amazing how just 6 weeks in a cast, how weak that hand has
Mm,
become. People don't get it. You stick a dog in a kennel, a cage for years, and he could barely use his legs. And I know I'm jumping forward in the story, but you can tell us. So give us a thumbnail sketch of the situation he came from, what happens to these lamb animals, and then his particular story of rehabilitation. Let's just go there first.
okay. So I found out about an organization that gets dogs out of labs, and this is a really small number of dogs. I mean, most dogs that are used for research and testing and other animals are euthanized, so they never make it out of the lab. But there's a small number that, after the research is done, they can be adopted out. And so I volunteered with his organization, signed up as a foster, brought home this dog as a foster dog, and wasn't sure that I wanted to adopt him because at that point I was a travel writer. And I just thought, oh my gosh, he can't even leave the house. He was so nervous. He never didn't want to leave his bed. We'd go outside and every little noise scared him. I tell a story in the book about a leaf fluttering down from a tree and he would jump or cringe. And it wasn't until he ran away because he was just scared. I don't know if he was running away from me. He just was afraid. So he ran away and I ran, this is in a neighborhood that was in a different state. I ran a few blocks and found him. And it wasn't until that point that I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot imagine losing this dog. And whatever I need to do, I am going to adopt him. This wasn't a foster situation anymore.
Yeah.
So I adopted him in 2013, and it took many months for him to really be functional, just in terms of walking around the block and not being terrified of everything. And that got better over the years. His whole life, though, and we were together for a decade, his whole life, there were certain sounds that scared him, including at one point, the little chime on an iPhone
Mm.
would make him tremble. And so everywhere I went, I had to tell people to turn off your phone and turn down your volume. And, I just wanted to protect him.
Yeah.
And for the first 7 or 8 years we were together, I really just showed people the tattoo in his ear. And I said he was in a lab. And that's kind of all I knew. And people were
Yeah.
often surprised and couldn't believe that we're doing dog research in this day and age. And eventually, during the pandemic, when I lost all of my freelance work,
Yeah.
I decided that I need to really dig into this because I have questions. I don't know the answers. Like, why was he bred in the first place? And what happened to him? And what are we doing with dogs? And so that's when I really dug in 2021 and decided to put together a book proposal. Had no idea where it was going to go. And here we are 4 years later.
You to just, I know this is painful, but I think we need to get a description, which I know you have also done with me when we've talked, but also in your writing of articles, as well as the story in the book. Um, I think most of us shy away from trying to remember what's going on in the same way that we don't want to really think about, you know, oncology or pathology or things that lead to a contemplation of our own mortality, let alone cruelty to animals that we love, especially if we have dogs. But let me just ask you for a little thumbnail of what the state of the union is in terms of animal research right now in the United States that's going on to other hammies as we speak. And then we'll get back into your book about this
Okay.
particular animal.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that because it does, I think an overview is helpful. And let me just go back a few generations. So in 1966, the Animal Welfare Act was passed, and that regulates all lab animals that are covered under that, which is not all lab animals. It doesn't
Yeah.
include mice and fish and rats, but we're talking about dogs, cats, monkeys, guinea pigs, rabbits, and the animals that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act, there's more than 700,000 animals in labs today. When you
Yeah,
count mice and rats, it's up in the tens of millions
sure.
per year. Um, Dogs, there are still more than 40,000 dogs in labs today. And I like to look at it in three categories. One is biomedical research, where there's a scientist who has a question about maybe cardiovascular disease or diabetes, and they use the dog or other animals as their model. So they're modeling the human body and human disease, and they are maybe giving that animal drugs or putting a dog on a treadmill, putting a medical device in a dog, and just seeing how the body reacts. And more often than not, the animal is euthanized, and then they study their tissues and organs to see how things have been affected. The second category is products, and the big one is drugs, because right now all drugs are still tested on animals, and a lot of them are tested on dogs. They're typically tested on one rodent and one non-rodent. The non-rodent's either a dog or a non-human primate. And if you're a drug company, you might be doing some computer modeling, you might be doing some AI, some non-animal tests, but then everything still goes through the rodent and non-rodent testing before it goes to human clinical trial. And there's some other products like cleaners. Animals really are not tested anymore in this country for cosmetics and personal care products, but it's a good idea to look for the cruelty-free logo on those products just to make sure that you aren't buying anything tested on animals. And the third category is education, which we've made huge leaps in the right direction in that dogs used to be in just about every med school until the last couple decades. And now med schools are using, they're using non-living simulations and a lot of, more human relevant things to learn. And vet schools still use dogs. They use some live dogs, they use cadavers, but they use them for training.
I know
Less
this would be an
invasive.
odd question that I want to throw, but have you ever talked to anyone who has been an experimenter with animals that changed their mind and is sorry?
I have, yeah. There's a really small but robust group of former researchers who have done a 180 and they've become animal activists and studied the ethics of this, and it's really interesting. There's John Gluck is one of those. He had his own primate lab in New Mexico for many years, and he's written a really good book about this. Just following his story is remarkable. The way he's turned around and seen things from a different side.
Yeah, I don't know, and forgive me because I've talked to a lot of people recently about my book, so I forget who I've talked to about what. But have you read Heron Wood's research from the Duke Canine Center? They run the Duke Canine Center that probably does more good stuff in terms of studying animals. No, they are not experimenting on anybody. They love their animals. They love dogs. But they have this theory that came out of that human and dog evolution keys off something they call the survival of the friendliest, cooperation. And I think your story is one of those stories. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
I haven't read that. I'm familiar with the Canine Cognition Center and some of their work, but I haven't read that.
Yeah, because I would think they want to read your book. Let me make a suggestion. Get it to Woods and Hare at the Canine Center at Duke, because it is so much in your neck of the woods. They're so much on your side, and they've done so much research, like Jessica Pierce and some other people have. They're going to love your book, if I may just suggest something.
So I know Brian Hare has read it because he wrote a wonderful endorsement. But I should reconnect with him.
Now, how can you know he's read it? And then I'm saying to you, like, do you know about them? And it's like, oh yeah, he endorsed it. Okay, great. Well, this is like your all the. I mean, talk about name dropping. Sure, he endorsed it. Along with Isabella Rossellini.
She did not. She inspired me years ago because I interviewed her about raising guide dog puppies. And after that, I went out and volunteered and tried to raise a guide dog puppy. I don't know how successful I was, but I loved the work that she was doing. She would have these puppies in her home, and then they would go off to the next stage of their training to end up becoming a guide dog. So,
Okay, so let's go to the next section here and just ask
okay.
about Jane Goodall's endorsement since we're doing name dropping now. And then I'll tell you about how I knew the Bush presidents for a while and my parents stayed in the White House. And then when we get past that, and I mentioned somewhere in passing that I've been on Oprah about 1,000 years ago, then let's get back into your book. So just tell us about Jane Goodall for a minute.
Okay, and then I think we should just skip the name
And
dropping.
Oprah doesn't have a book club anymore, so too bad. Sorry for you. Although she didn't have my book as a selection. She had me on as part of a panel, but she still put me on a bestseller list in terms of what I was selling that day. Anyway, she'll like your book too, by the way. But tell me about Jane Goodall. What was that all about?
So, I had listened to a number of podcasts with Jane, and I knew that dogs were her favorite animal. She said this many times, and then I saw her speak live in Atlanta last fall, and oh my gosh, she was just like a rock star. I mean, packed auditorium at Fox Theater, and she just, just seeing her there was amazing. I will never forget that. So, when it came time that the manuscript was done and the my editor said, okay, we've got to get the blurbs now, which every author hates doing. I'd been thinking about her because I thought, well, dogs are her favorite animal and she really cares about this. And, she began caring about animal research once she saw chimps in labs. And so I knew this was on her radar, of course. And so I wrote to somebody, actually, Jessica Pierce put me in touch with Mark Bekoff, another bioethicist. And Mark said, well, if you want to send me a letter to Jane, I can pass it along because they had done a lot of collaborating, and which was amazing. So I wrote the
Yeah,
letter, and her people responded pretty quickly and said this issue is really important to her, and
yeah.
we'll see what we can do. So it probably took a few months and a lot of, me emailing them and very gently nudging,
Yeah, yeah.
and we got this amazing thing back. So yeah, I'm forever grateful.
Well, lucky you. And I love this thing that her people, I can't say her people because Ernie Gregg produces my podcast. So I just say my person. I'm
Well,
my
Ernie
dog's
Ernie
person.
does so much. All you need is one.
Yeah. If you have Ernie, that's all you need. But um, yeah, I have a question. One detail, we have a book club called It Has to Be Read, and I'm hoping we can get Ernie to put in the chat section what date we're going on. So we want to do it for December, if that's okay. I'm sorry, we're a day late and a dollar short, but at least December's still within this cycle. So once again, I just want to tell people, if you're going to give any book for any holiday this year, um, this is the book to give because it's a book that tugs at the heartstrings, but it also teaches an ethical lesson. And I want to propose something to you because I think actually the message of your book goes beyond the rehabilitation of Hammy, and it goes to something that I think is very important to me personally, and that I've spent the last few years working on in terms of the book I've got going out, and that is the rehabilitation of our relationships with human beings. Because I don't think these are different projects. I think they're all the same project in terms of how we treat other entities that are cognizant and aware and alive and can be afraid when a leaf comes down because they've been stuck in a cage. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I think there's sort of the implied rules of behavior that are in your book are basically the rules of cooperation, kindness, and friendliness, and the survival of the friendliest that, I think is our only hope for the future as a species. Forget dogs for a minute, but just humans. I know that's huge and big and waxes larger than maybe you want to go, but I just feel that's where your book leads.
Mhm. That's nice to hear. Thank you. I don't know how conscious I was of that, but certainly from the beginning, one of my dreams was to get people in the room together, people on opposing sides of this really controversial issue. And I didn't, not because I didn't try, but
Right.
I haven't given up hope because I was on a radio show recently and they had a couple people calling in and somebody from an animal welfare group and somebody from a pro research or from the research community.
Yeah.
And I realized what they were saying was not that different.
Yeah.
And, I think everybody wants to move in the direction of using non animal alternatives. But finding this common ground and getting people at the table together and having
Yeah.
these discussions, it's so important. And like you said, just the kindness and being human to each other and humane and all of this really is important when you're talking about something that's this difficult and delicate and it's easy to not be that way.
Yeah, we're talking about lab dog, a beagle, and his human investigate the surprising world of animal research. I like how you've included him in the authorship of the book. It's you're investigating this with your dog. Um, so anyway, yeah, let me just go to that issue. And this is not in any sense political, and we're not going there. But it seems to me that your book about your relationship in this rescue is one of the very few things I can think of, other than say apple pie and one or two other things about which we can all agree. Because in all honesty and all joking aside, there are people on all parts of the political spectrum who would be horrified to walk into a lab and see a row of beagles, some of whom have had their vocal cords cut so the researchers aren't bothered by their barking. I can think of a lot of my friends who vote for people that I don't like who would agree on this with me because they love their dogs. I see them out walking their dog. I see them loving their dog. My friend down the street who, had a political sign outside his house that I didn't agree with the other day, but I still helped him string his Christmas lights, by the way, because he's my neighbor, the spirit of your book. Um, Picked his beautiful little dog up the other day, who also is a rescue, and showed me this phenomenal scar where she went to have a big surgical procedure that must have cost him a fortune. And this is just a regular guy who has spent the money he's got on extending this dog's life after telling me on several discussions with him about the fact that he had a long discussion with the vet. Am I just doing this selfishly? Will she still have a good life? And the vet was saying, yep, she has this huge tumor, and it's the equivalent of a full hysterectomy for a female human. And I'm going to, and I would not do this. We're going to make sure she doesn't suffer. And massive incision, huge surgery, probably one of the most expensive procedures you could do. But, this is a guy a lot of my progressive friends would not particularly like because of other things he would do or say. But when it comes to your book, he'll be giving this for Christmas when I tell him about it, because you've struck a note that binds us together in this cooperation of the survival of the friendliest. And I really mean that as the highest praise I can give this, because right now in our moment in history, this is rare. It's a gift. Um, and I don't think we can take what you've done for granted, because here's a book around which we can all rally. And I would just put that out there as a thought to you. I don't know how you react to that.
I appreciate that. I think what I would want for the book is that it becomes part of the conversation, that people are talking about this instead of not talking about it, because it's
Right.
it's just been in the dark for a really long time.
Yeah.
People are still surprised. The Envigo Beagle rescue of 2022, 3 years ago now, that
Yeah.
was 4,000 beagles. And I wonder if some people think that happened and now we're done with that. Everything's okay.
Yeah.
But it's not. There's tens of thousands of dogs still in labs. And the science that we're learning from these animals is not it's often not repeatable. It doesn't tell us a lot in terms of what drugs might be safe for humans.
Yeah,
It tells us that the drugs are safe in animals, but then they are tested in humans and they end up
sure.
not being safe in humans. So, I would like for this book to be part of that dialogue and have people talk about it in a kind, informed way.
Yeah, I want to talk about Lapdog in two ways now. First, I'm going to ask you two questions, and because I'm 73, I'm going to ask you to remind me what my second question was.
Okay.
The two questions are, let's take a minute and just tell the story of Lapdog that you tell in your book. I was going to read a whole bunch of passages, and I thought, that's crazy. I've got Melanie here. Why am I reading her book to her? They can, listen to it when they want to, in some other format. But I want you to tell the story, but I also want to tell you what the state of the union is on the change in science. And I know that AI may play a part. Things are moving in that direction. So don't let me forget that second question. But
Okay.
before we go any further, give us a thumbnail of Lapdog. We're on a plane. We're having a cup of coffee. Oh, you've written a book. I don't know anything about you. What's your book about? What's your book about?
It's about my journey with Hammy to learn about his background, why dogs have been used for research and testing historically,
Yeah.
how they're still used today, and this is a nice transition to the next topic, and what it means for the future.
Hmm.
Whether we will still be using dogs in the future, how that's changing, not only because people want dogs out of labs, but because we have technologies now that are more relevant for human medicine.
Yeah. Okay, so that was it.
That's my thumbnail.
Well, enlarge a little bit. Tell the Hammy story, and then we'll go forward.
Hammy had been traveling with me for my travel stories. And so
Yeah,
it was a really natural pivot for me to say, okay, Hammy, we're getting in the car. We are not going to write about fun things to do in Boulder, but we're going to go visit a lab. We're going to go visit, somebody in Boston who's making organs on chips that mimic human organs. We're going to
yeah,
go visit, a dog researcher in North Carolina. We're going to go to a sanctuary in Wyoming
mm,
where rescued research animals live the rest of their lives. Um, so, he was great in the car, and it was always fun to go on a road trip with him. And I
yeah,
also wanted these people I was interviewing. I wanted the researchers and the ethicists and the veterinarians, former
sure.
lab veterinarians. I wanted them to meet him too. So it
Mhm.
wasn't just me there with a notebook. It was just seeing their interactions. And a lot of people haven't met a former lab dog before.
Yeah,
I mean, even people who work in labs, who spent careers in labs, have not met a dog who is on the outside, who's learned to live
yeah,
in a home and go on road trips. And so
yeah.
he was really special in that way too. He was special in every way.
Mm,
But I wanted to say, here's Hammy. Here's his tattoo.
yeah,
This is the life he has now. And he's made my life so much better. He's completely changed my life.
yeah.
And so I wanted to get that message across as well.
Yeah, and you did very effectively. And I want to mention to people who don't know your work, they're going too soon because this is going to be our book club offering in December. This is a book with a message, but it's not a book that hits you over the head with the message. It's a message of love and basically a message of compassion. And I want to say something about your writing. When the first stuff I read of yours was some of your travel writing, and I remember going to a site, I forget if it was yours or the Washington Post or someone, I'm sort of all the subjects you wrote on. And I forget if you were on a motorcycle or an Airstream trailer or whatever you're doing. And the one thing you bring, the sensibility you always bring, is the love of your subject. So, you're a really good writer. And the thing that you convey is that you're just happy to be alive and out there looking at things. Hammy was very lucky, I may say, because he got a person who knows how to live to be his person. And then you made him a co-author. So he wrote a book with you. But you bring that quality to this story. When you're done this, your reader knows you, knows Hammy, but above all knows that you take a great deal of joy in the experience of being alive, and you find a great deal of beauty, an overused word, but there's a lot of beauty in your relationship. And so I don't know how you feel about that. Do you do this on purpose, or is this just something that is you, or um, lab dog, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Talk about that. Talk about that that basic baseline of yours, whether you're doing a travel story or a science story or a tech story or this story. There's a certain baseline with you, which is about the experience and the beauty you find in it.
I don't think that it came naturally, and there's a lot of journalists who are reluctant to use the first person at all and to put themselves in the story. But I think once I started doing more travel stories,
Hmm.
somebody said to me once, I think it was a journalist, a longtime journalist, said, I was concerned about pitching stories and thinking, oh, I don't know if the editor is going to like that. Is anyone else going to care about this? And they said, if this is something that you feel passionate about, whatever it is, that's going to come through. And just go ahead and pitch that story and write that story. And I've just really lived by that since then. And this is decades ago. And it's true. I think if you are passionate about something and that comes through in your writing and your experience and your curiosity and openness to other people and places, that comes through in the writing. And people would say to me, I feel like I was there no matter where I went, whether I was staying overnight in this big Beagle hotel in Idaho or overnighting in one of the Airstreams in West Virginia.
Yeah.
They'd say, I felt like I was there with you. And that's the highest compliment I could get, because that means I did my job describing where I was and giving them a feel of
Yeah.
the place. And so I think that helped when I went to write Lab Dog, because I wasn't just writing about the people who are doing the science or who are fighting to get animals out of labs. I was writing about what these places felt like and smelled like, and what Hammy saw, and what we experienced sitting down with somebody. A lot of these details that I just was very accustomed to noticing. We sat with one researcher at his home, and he just jumped up at one point, and I tell the story in the book, and he pointed at a squirrel out the kitchen window, and the squirrel was kind of doing gymnastics on the bird feeder. And when he jumped up, Hammy jumped up. And that has nothing to do with dogs and labs, but it was like that was a moment that was part of what we were experiencing with him. I mean, here's someone who's spent his whole career experimenting on animals, and him noticing this squirrel just seemed really important to me. He was observant, and he was thoughtful. And so, I guess deciding what details to include and what not to include. I mean, that's all part of writing, as you know.
Well, when I think of that story, it goes back to the question I asked you a little while ago about people who may have been in that experimenting on animals community, whose own sensibilities are then awakened by your story in Lab Dog of Hammy and you. I think that could be another person like that. I don't know.
I don't know either.
Oh, is he going to read the book?
We just emailed recently, and I think and hope he will.
Yeah, I mean, you should just send it to him and say, hey, repent.
Well, the researchers were brought up in a culture of animal research, because that's what their teachers and instructors and mentors did, and that was just the way that it's done. And they have felt like they're doing good in the world. They're trying to find cures for rare diseases, or they're trying to learn something that's going to help humans, because somebody has a daughter or a son or a parent who has a rare disease that we don't have a cure for. And so the intention of all these people is good. And I think that's something that's lost often when we're just reading or hearing what animal activists have to say.
Sure.
So, and that's really what I wanted to come through in the book is that, there are two really important sides here. And there's also a middle, and there's also different things that we can do as voters and places where we can spend our money and things we can write to our elected officials. There's things we can do. We just can't do it if we don't know about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I felt reading Lab Dog that, one of the things about your book is like so many things, when you hear about something where there's massive suffering or a disaster, or, it's hard to relate. But when you get to know one person who went through something, or someone, in that bus crash that kills 50, and you don't think about it. But if you knew somebody, it's different. I think the gift is that by the time we're done with Lab Dog, we know someone who's been through this. And we know Hammy well, and we are fond of Hammy. And I think that's a gift to the discussion, because it doesn't matter, what side you're on, in quotes, but to not have a connection with anybody intimately involved with any issue means you can't bring any kind of informed opinion to it.
Yeah.
I have never met anybody who voted for so and so, or I don't even know anyone like that. This is not where good discussions begin. So I think the level of empathy and understanding, and you're in this story you bring, you one thing for sure is no one can ever say, well, I don't know any dog that's been through this personally, because now they do.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's the personal connection. Hammy becomes the face of dog research, and I've had early career scientists who are learning about non-animal ways of testing. Hammy and I spoke at a conference. We both sat on stage, and they came up to me afterwards and said, "We've never met a dog who has been in lab before." And for them, it was just like, oh, they were doing all of this work to move away from animal testing, and they knew intellectually
Yeah.
about it, but then they had this space to connect to it, and they said, oh, this is why we're doing what we do. It's because of beings like Hammy. So I
Yeah.
think that makes a huge
Well,
difference.
and you don't make a connection. I remember I lived in Africa for a year directing a couple movies back in the days when I was a film director. And, it's one thing to read about South Africa. It's another thing to find out that the maid that the apartheid system allowed to work for me, because the producers gave Jeannie and I a maid to work in our house. And so she came under the terms of the old people who had been there. And then I found out that what we were paying her, in Rand, which I didn't even understand when I first got there, wasn't enough for her to even make her bus fare back to the
Mm.
township. And this wasn't an issue somewhere now. This was Johanna, who was becoming a friend of our family. And now all of a sudden, this was personal. And so it wasn't an issue anymore for me of apartheid versus this or that, or slow change, fast change. Once I got involved with Johanna and her family, it changed everything. And I only tell that story because I think that psychologically, I remember reading an article one time about one of the countries where they eat dogs and slaughter them for eating. And then they said, but of course, this never happens to pet dogs because they're in the house. And what you've done is you've taken someone out of the cage that is just being kept as a food source. And you have said, no, no, this Hammy is now a member of my family. And so that sort of convenient line disappears. And it reminds me of a good friend of mine in Nashville, Tennessee, who's in the music business down there, who has a sideline, once got me on a bus tour because he gets all his rich and famous friends in the recording business to visit prisons with him. And these are maximum security places you can't get into, but because of his connections, you can. So all of a sudden, you're sitting down with people who are doing 30 years, and who are there forever. And then you walk away with a couple of names, and from then on, you're corresponding with them. And then all of a sudden, it's not the prison population. It's like this guy called Joshua that I write to and follow what happens to him. And I think you've done that here. And obviously, it changes everything. In other words, a lab dog is still a dog. It's the same kind of dog we fall in love with and we love. So
Right,
I take it personally. When I read about Hammy, it's like, you can't do that to Zip. That's my
right. It's
friend.
It is. And I think, I mean, what I learned in reporting on this is that sometimes in the lab, I mean, whether it's a dog or a mouse or a rabbit, because we know they
Sure.
all have personalities and you can fall in love with any of these species.
Yeah.
Sometimes the lab techs do avoid naming them
Yeah.
because once they have a name, you
Yeah.
do get attached
Yeah.
and it becomes really hard. So they have to distance themselves. There are other times when they do name the dogs and the primates,
Yeah.
in particular, but I think for them to do their job, I mean, the animals are quite often, um, they're things, they are ordered, it's inventory, it's it's a commodity. I mean, they're not treated as beings,
Yeah.
because this is what they need to do their job.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's right. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think this is how they have to look at it to get through their day and to do their work.
Yeah, Ernie Gregg, my producer, just texted me a little thing in the chat section, and I love this question. I'm going to throw it at you. Hammy exhibited huge forgiveness toward humans. What can we learn from that?
Oh, I love that, Ernie. Yeah, from the very beginning, I didn't know when I brought him home on that first day I was fostering him. I didn't know if he wanted nothing to do with me, if he was going to be scared of me, but he desperately wanted my attention,
Mm,
from that first moment. And I took that as a good sign. I think that, I think dogs are so resilient. It's just
yeah,
amazing what they
yeah,
can get through. And that he learned to trust and to bond and to love me. And um, yeah, it's really amazing. It was amazing and such a gift to watch that with him. And you're right. I mean, they teach us so much. There's so many lessons.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me, to go to the correlation that I make between my dog Zip and my behavior. I mean, now this is going to sound like a stretch, and no, I'm not promoting my new book, but of course, I sort of am. Changes the way that I relate to my wife of 56 years because dogs set a hell of an example of behavior in terms of forgiveness and kindness and tolerance and being there for you. And it's a kind of a quiet moral rebuke of some of the things that I dislike most about myself and have worked with and struggled with. And Zip sort of is a, I joke and say this is my sort of priest and confessor because Zip's moral guide when it comes to forgiveness and putting up with human failings. And I think your story that Ernie has zeroed in on in terms of forgiveness. Um, it's amazing to me because for one thing, we know, and Jessica Pierce and all these people who do this wonderful research know that what a dog is more than anything else is a social creature. So to put a dog in any form of isolation is just about as cruel a thing as you can do to that species of animal. Because what they do in the wild, village dogs, as they roam around the dump of Mexico City or near an African village, you don't see a dog by herself or himself. Dogs are social creatures. And then they take that sociability and that connectiveness, So if there was one dog commandment like the Ten Commandments, it would be alone is bad. And to think of putting a dog alone in a cage, untouched by a human hand or another dog, literally to me is like a nightmare. And so when you bring this dog into your life who's now afraid of everything because he's had the most unnatural existence a dog can have, which is to be solitary and not to be touched with affection by either another dog or a human, because dogs are very affectionate to each other too. Talk about that a little bit, just sort of the transition for Hammy from isolation to companionship, because it would seem to me that goes to Ernie's question, because that's the big jump, isn't it? Like to find any human you'd ever trust, or forget just trusting the human, being able to relate to somebody after you've been in an isolation cell for so long. I mean, this is solitary confinement.
Yeah, Frank, I don't know exactly what his circumstance was. I know in some labs they had kennels with, maybe two dogs. And I also know that some lab techs or caretakers would take the dogs out, probably more than any other species in labs, take them out and hold them and play with toys with them in the hallway. So that did
Sometimes.
happen. That did happen sometimes. And so I just want to be very careful because I
Yeah.
don't know what he experienced. And but you're right. Sometimes that didn't happen at all. Sometimes they were in their own cages. They didn't have feel human touch. They didn't interact with other dogs.
Yeah.
And I like how you say that in the Gospel of Zip about isolation being bad or being alone as being bad.
Yeah.
And we domesticated this species to be with us,
Yeah.
not to be separate from us or on the other side of a cage door. And I noticed a couple interesting things when I brought him home. He didn't have any spatial awareness.
Mm.
So I'd go to put him on a bed and he'd roll over and had no idea he was about to fall off until I caught him.
Sure.
He, he didn't know how to go upstairs at all. He didn't know how to jump on a couch. So I had to train
Mm.
him how to do that because he'd never seen stairs before, I assume.
Yeah.
And he also really didn't relate well to other dogs. He didn't relate poorly. He just didn't really relate to them. He
Sure.
sniffed them but he usually wasn't playing with them. He wasn't playing with toys. He just wanted my attention and he wanted food.
Yeah.
So I was able to use food to train him, which was helpful.
Mm.
And just to keep rewarding him and reinforcing all the good things he did. And over time, he built confidence. Going to new places was still a little bit scary for him
Yeah.
for his whole life. But,
Yeah.
I did a lot of my writing in a rural part of Virginia that was just very quiet and open. And
Mm.
he had, big spaces to roam. And that was just such a treat to see him
Yeah.
there and to see him happy and free. And it's just felt like this is what all my work with him was for, is to give him these years.
Yeah, and in a minute we'll wind this up, but I don't want to end before I say to you, I think the most interesting question, and you do talk about this in the book somewhat, but other than the fact that Hammy brought out so much of what you talk about, how do you, if you had to just pick something where you changed, how did Hammy change you? And I'm not talking about your views or, any of that, although that can be, any answer you want, but um, when I look at Zip, I said this before, he's changed one thing about me, and that is I never imagined, I'm 73 years old, and if you had told me 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there will come a day in your life when you will honestly be able to look people in the face and say, you wish you were as kind and empathetic as a dog, and where you measure your behavior against how Zip treats you, and you are literally a better husband, father, and friend, more than any sermon I've ever heard or anything like that. I mean, this is a weird way to put this, but Zip shames me into behavior that no human was able to teach me. I know that sounds like a stretch, but that's literally the case. And I've learned some of those things along the way, which is one reason I'm still married, obviously. But, this thing that Ernie brought up about forgiveness and so forth, I never would have foreseen that I would learn what you might say, sort of a moral part of the moral spiritual journey any life is, that my high points would be meeting Jeannie and marrying her, followed very closely by several dogs I've had that I talk about in the book, but also especially this one little dog, Zip, who has revealed himself as a kind of a prophet of, hey, this is how it all ought to be. And I know that sounds nuts to someone who hasn't experienced it. So how did Hammy instruct you or change you or compare yourself? Or what did you really, bottom line, looking back 10 years from now at this whole experience, other than the book coming out of it, how did Hammy minister to you?
Oh, I I definitely became a more patient person
Hmm.
with him. It did require a lot of patience.
Hmm.
I think nursing him back to health might be a stretch saying that, but psychologically, it did feel like that. I
Yeah.
was there every moment when he was trembling and scared
Yeah.
and trying to fit in this life.
Yeah.
So um, that took a lot of patience. And
Mm.
I mean, this is a little bit of a cliche, but just the being in the moment. And as we wrap this up, I will go back to your first question about what it was like, that day, or I guess the preceding days before I lost Hammy. And I just kept reminding myself to be in the moment, because
Yeah.
we were going to his favorite parks, and he was trotting around, and he didn't know what was coming. And I tried to not think about what was coming. I just tried to be there with him.
Mm.
And it's such an important lesson, especially today when we're on our screens all the time and
Yeah.
distracted, and the news cycle is so fast, and
Yeah.
it's so easy to get caught up in that. And just to step away and be is huge lesson. And so I think about him all the time. When I'm just trying to take care of myself and be my best person, and take myself out to a park and go for a walk and just enjoy being alive.
Yeah, and I think conversely, what I learned from your book and the impression I take away most, and the reason that I will be giving your book to people as a gift this Christmas, is because your compassion is infectious. And if I had to give a book to anyone where I said the ultimate thing this book is about, whatever you think this book is about, what this book is about is the preciousness of the experience of life.
Mm.
And I think your affection for Hammy is really a lesson. I mean, you've taught me something. It's like, be like Zip. And if that fails, be like Melanie. Go the extra mile, be patient and care, and you will get back exactly what you put in. And I think in an age besotted by selfishness and all the rest of it, your book is an antidote to the worst things that are in all of us and have infected our age, whatever you come down on in terms of politics or religion or these other things. I just can't thank you enough. And, in that sense, I think dogs, domesticated us, and my dogs have domesticated me. And I think the same with you because, you were the nurse, but without that patient that you loved, that side of you would not have come out.
Oh, absolutely. That's yeah, that's so true, everything you said.
Mm.
I will look forward to talking to you more about Zip and the
Yeah,
Gospel of Zip.
yeah.
So
Well, I
nice to
really,
be on this
really,
journey
really, really
together.
recommend the book. We're going to make it our book club offering in December. Do me a favor when I sign off here, stay around for 2 minutes. I know you talked to Ernie a lot because I was late. Um, which Ernie, I promise you will never happen again. But so spend a minute talking to Ernie about other things we can do to promote the book, how to link
Thank
to it,
you.
make sure we have everything right. And anyone you suggest we talk to, I think you got me to Jessica Pierce or vice versa. There are other people like that um, that I'd like to talk to about, these subjects where you and I have a common interest. So, on my podcast, if they've written something or done anything, or maybe not, just someone doing something good. So, Melanie Kaplan, I just want to thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I love talking to you and talking about dogs, and I look forward to the next time. So thanks,
Yeah,
Frank.
well, I'm very invested in your story and I thank you for it. So stick around
Thank
and talk
you.
to Ernie for a minute. Thank you so much for
Okay.
your patience and me being late too.
Thanks, Frank.
Okay, bye.